All right, I have the pleasure of introducing a friend of mine, Benjamin Marx, who is the editor-in-chief of economics.org.au. Ben was one of the founding members of the organizing committee for the Australian Mises Seminar, and was essential in turning what was a good idea discussed over some Korean food over lunch between Michael Conahan and I to a successful seminar that we're all enjoying at the moment that's now in its third year. So everyone in the liberty movement, I've noticed, has a niche that they really love. And Ben's has unquestionably been Australian libertarian history. I've heard him mention that he was going to the library while he was up in Queensland to dig up some old publications from the Workers' Party. And the emerging success of libertarianism in Australia has been built on the shoulders of giants. And these giants were at one time unsung heroes. But thanks to Benjamin Marx, we can celebrate their achievements and honor their efforts that have brought us where we are today. So would you please join me in welcoming Benjamin Marx to the platform as he talks about Australian libertarian history.
Thanks, Washington. Thanks, everyone. So everyone knows I'm really interested in Australian libertarian history, but there's so much I still don't know. Like, for example, just 2 days ago, I got this email from someone who, David Sharp's in the audience, who used to run all the big Adam Smith Institute Melbourne events, and he knows this guy, so he can vouch for him. But here's an email I received. Hello, Benjamin. Having read your missives for some time, it occurred to me that some readers might be interested in the details of the final death throes of the Workers' Party, epitomised by the murder of Paul Cratoulis. He and I were soulmates at that time, and I believe I'm the only person in possession of intimate information about Paul and how and why the murder occurred. We considered ourselves to be very consistent anarcho-capitalists. The information would die with me, so if you'd be interested in publishing it, please let me know, bearing in mind that I'm not computer literate. So, I'd never heard of Paul Cratoulis. I look him up. Maureen Nathan's heard of him. So there's a whole new avenue of research to be done that I'd never heard of. And that was the Workers' Party Victoria, and the source has some plausibility, at least. So that's something. In some ways, Australian libertarian history is just pointing to people in the audience and saying, all right, you speak about what you've done. Anyway, I know at least enough to safely say that Australia is the centre of the worldwide libertarian movement and is the country with the most excitement for libertarians and the most potential for radical free market reforms. I mean, there's not many countries in the world that attract people like Hopper, Bloch, Jeffrey Tucker. So, so Australia is not a country that should just be replicating think tank or other advocacy models from England and America. We have our own unique history and should really be the ones exporting our ideas to them rather than the other way around. It is all very well not to be xenophobic, but that does not mean we should be totally excluding Australian history from our considerations. It's funny how much Australian libertarian history is ignored. Most Australian free market activists practice what I think should be called a priori activism. They hate a priorism when it comes to economic science, the method of economic science is practiced by the Austrian school and the followers of Ludwig von Mises. But when it comes to activism, it is a priorism that most Australian free market activists are committed to. They do not reference history at all in their strategic considerations. So, a priori activists. It's as though they look up the definition of a think tank, think, oh, you know, we're a think tank. Think tanks act. Therefore, it follows that this is what a think tank does, all with no reference to Australian history. So in this speech, I'll introduce you to some of the major figures and milestones of Australian libertarian history. I want to acknowledge some people in the audience who are kindly here to, I guess, oversee the proceedings, but have not been to previous Mises seminars. Firstly, Bob Howard is sitting over there. He's the intellectual force behind the Workers' Party. It's great to have him here. And the best history and best constructive criticism of the Australian libertarian movement in the 70s is Bob Howard's 1979 Playboy essay and also his series of Reason magazine articles in 74, 75, 76, and 77. Each year he wrote an article on the state of the Australian libertarian movement. And those recent magazine articles are written for an international audience, so it's particularly useful for us today because we are all basically foreigners to our own history. All these documents are available free online at workersparty.info. The other person I want to mention is Michael Darby, he might not be here now, but he'll always be floating around somewhere. Or maybe floating's not the right word. Michael has done everything that everyone here has done, but better, apart from the Workers' Party. In 1974, he ran against Whitlam and Whitlam's electorate, and he has been active before then and ever since. In 1978, he was quoted in the mainstream press saying that he wouldn't rule out privatising the police. Also in 1978, this is what an article in the Sydney Morning Herald said. Said, Lang Hancock, this is the article, so it gets to it. Lang Hancock just has to be one of the most interesting, straight-shooting, free-thinking, laissez-faire rough diamonds in Australia, if not the world. The self-made millionaire mining magnate from Western Australia is praised as a man who has contributed more wealth to the country than any other man in our history. I just had to be present at a luncheon arranged by Derby Communications Proprietary Limited to hear Mr. Hancock speak on what would we do without our government. The luncheon for about 400 businessmen was held at the Siebel Townhouse. So that conference sounds more radical than this one. And 400 people in 1978. And Lang Hancock was more radical than any of us. He was more radical than Rothbard or Hopper. In a 1984 letter to the editor in The Australian that I only found a month or so ago when looking for something else, it's just a coincidence, pure luck. I've never seen it referenced anywhere else. I found Lang Hancock saying that if a politician wants his support, they have to promise two things. Firstly, to never pass any legislation of any kind in either house. Secondly, to repeal legislation in the order of the last to come, the first to go, so as to avoid any silly, futile intellectual discussion as to what, if any, legislation should remain. So, all that, Hopper, Rothbard intellectual investigation, just get rid of it. Now, you can't get more radical than that. And it is not some stupid university student or professor saying it, but a businessman whose projects require huge numbers of government approvals. How can it be that in Australia, the most radical business people are not the university students or the dropouts or the young radicals, but the big business people who have the most to lose? I mean, we all know about Neville Kennard, there's others. Also about Hancock, Dr. Leithner mentioned Higgs and the ratchet effect. Hancock was writing about the ratchet effect in 1974, 13 years before Crisis and Leviathan. Lang Hancock was a great writer, passionate. He'd great turns of phrase. He'd talk about all the government predictions, and he'd say, well, they need to polish their crystal ball. So, great lines. Anyway, do you know the most important year for radical libertarians in Australia? It's the year 1969. So I hope you all remember this, 1969. That's when Australia's Ron Paul and Australia's Frederick Bastiat, Bert Kelly, started his modest member column in the Australian Financial Review. Online at bertkelly.info, there's over 100 of those columns. And Bert Kelly deserves worldwide attention for his brilliant, timeless essays. His main technique was to quote politicians' own words back to them, which means his essays are timeless. He would quote a senior figure saying that they oppose government interference, then quote them another time saying that they support government intervention. So Bert Kelly said there must be a difference between government intervention and government interference that is too profound for his modest intellect. Another time, Bert Kelly would quote Malcolm Fraser opposing tariffs during a speech overseas and then quote him defending tariffs in a speech back home. Bert Kelly said that this must be because Fraser has two different speechwriters and they must have had a big fight and they are now not talking to each other. So Bert Kelly was always sympathetic to the people he was criticising, always trying to find what the plausible explanation is. Bert Kelly's columns were signed The Modest Member, not Bert Kelly, And he would pretend his wife was named Mavis and was always telling him to compromise so that he could become a minister and get a state funeral. In a column I found from the 1970s when he was writing his first book, he said that Mavis told him that it was customary for authors to dedicate their first book to their wives. Many months later, when Bert Kelly's autobiography came out, the dedication read, with no explanation, "To that bitch, Mavis." He had other characters, like Farmer Fred, Eccles the economist, and Bruce the industrial relations dinosaur. It is so rare for anyone to have so distinctive a writing style, but Bert Kelly did, and he was on our side. So we were very lucky to have someone like Bert Kelly, and we should stop ignoring him. Incidentally, without success in my review of last year's Mises seminar, I tried to write what Bert Kelly would think of the Mises seminar, quoting people's own words back to them and that kind of thing, and elicit some kind of response from Bert Kelly's old friends. But despite Ron Manners personally recommending that they read it, I got no response. So anyway, Bert Kelly is not even half the reason why 1969 is the most important year for radical libertarians in Australia. 1969 is also the year when John Singleton started his Libertarian column in Newspaper News, which later changed its name to Advertising News. And John Singleton, he was a brilliant writer. I say was, with a question mark. Incidentally, I invited him to come. I said, who was coming, and he said, I'll quote to you what he said. I'll find it. He said, yes, he'd love to see the old gang. We need a time capsule review, where we started, where we were proved right and wrong, and make next 5, 10, 20 years count. And then he said, send an email to diarize. So it was all confirmed, and then he unconfirmed, because obviously he has lots of important business to do all around the place. But that's not totally discouraging. But he's interested in the next 5, 10, 15 years. So you read any Australian free market advocate today, other than Viv Forbes, and you can almost share their pain trying to rack up the necessary number of words to make an article. Or you can pretty much tell what they're going to say by reading just the subject matter. But John Singleton's essays had endings that were like punchlines, and Singleton's voice alone had as much charisma as Mavis, Eccles, and Farmer Fred combined. My favourite Singleton essay is when he explored the Aboriginal drinking problem in remote Australia by travelling there and meeting the locals. At the end of his essay, Singleton said, "Whenever any of us civilised folk win the lotto, we take the day off work and drink and celebrate." So same with the Aboriginals. When they win the welfare payout lotto, which they do every day, they take the day off work and drink. It's rational. It is amazing how few people know anything about John Singleton's politics. Even some of the most senior Workers' Party colleagues of John Singleton, who are not here, so I don't know anyone here, told me that they don't think he really understood free market arguments and was not the real deal, and that Bob Howard ghosted all this stuff. There's no doubt Bob Howard helped huge amounts. But the more I researched Singleton, the more impressive he is. His articles in 1969, 1970, and 1971 show the principles he works by and helps us to understand him. He also quotes many figures that you can see influenced him, like Claude Hopkins, Gossage, and David Ogilvy. He wrote a great article elaborating on Ogilvy's comment on consumer protection. All the consumer protection laws assume that the consumer can't look after themselves. So what Ogilvy does, and Singleton loves, is to say, hang on a second, the consumer is your wife. So all those consumer protection laws are basically saying that you have a mindless wife. So let's speak a bit more about John Singleton. In 1974, he was always angry, but in 1974 he could see how crazy the Labor Party is, how their Labor Party platform said, as straightforward as can be, we will implement socialism. So he pretty much hijacked the federal election campaign for the Liberal Party in 1974, funded it himself and fundraised it himself. And his ads were getting like an Estonian lady to say, you know, she doesn't like the Labour Party because they're socialist and that's why she left Estonia. And ads like this, really, you know, straightforward anti-socialist ads. And although he didn't have the official advertising account, his election campaign for the Liberal Party was basically known as the Liberal advertising account, and it was endorsed by Sir Robert Askin and all sorts of other senior leaders. So it was all going quite well, but then Snedden said, you know, it's really quite cruel, Singleton's ads. Singleton was Prime Minister, really quite cruel, not opposition, quite cruel, Singleton's ads, because the Liberal Party, they're socialist too. We're socialist too. So that kind of took a lot of the oomph out of it. And, you know, but he basically had the federal Liberal Party advertising account. And so what does he do the next year? He starts a brand new political party with the help of Maureen, Bob, many other people. And, you know, it's the most radical political party the world has ever seen, the Workers' Party. Like they had the US Libertarian Party platform to work from, and they improved it, and the various senior people in the US said they agreed they improved it. And it reads beautifully, like it's, you know, David Hart said he was like the continuity man for the Workers' Party platform, made sure it read smoothly. And at the end of, it was like, what, 50 pages, 20 pages, something, bottom of each page, it says the principle that no man or group of men may aggress against the personal property of another, really trying to ram it home. And like that taxation policy read, well, it began, taxation is theft. I mean, it's amazing. And for a final reason why 1969 is so important, it is also the year when Lang Hancock started his own newspaper, the Sunday Independent, and he appointed Maxwell Newton as its first editor. Jeffrey Tucker, in his speech, he talked a bit about how department heads don't really have much power. It's the little bureaucrats. Maxwell Newton knew that and kind of made his career out of it. And I'll read you somewhere. So this is in an interview he had with Clyde Packer in 1984, but he's talking about him in the 60s, I guess. So this Maxwell Newton says, in Canberra, I was an innovator. I was one of the first journalists to penetrate the civil service. I ignored the politicians. They bored me. Alan Reid, who was a respectable politician, journalist, knew Roland Wilson, and he knew Alan Brown and Jack Bunting, the top department heads or department secretaries, on a sort of Commonwealth Club level. But I knew the grubby little bastards down the line who were doing the dirty work, and I got to know them very well and penetrated the whole setup. So Maxwell Newton, our only two daily national newspapers, the Finn Review and the Australian, they were both edited by Maxwell Newton. And he'd have huge numbers of low-level bureaucrats in his pay, leaking stuff all the time. But it's funny when you think about how neglected Maxwell Newton is, when you consider that his newspapers, they're saying, you know, they're all struggling, and they're saying they'll survive because of their masthead's reputation for quality journalism. So why don't they mention Maxwell Newton? And Maxwell Newton, he called his style of journalism violent. Like if he wasn't sued for defamation once a year, he'd think he's losing his touch. And he spoke at the first ever Mises Institute conference, but he was in Austrian school inexplicably. I can't understand why. And Bob Howard couldn't understand why when writing about him in Free Enterprise magazine in '76 or something. So, and I've spoken to people at the first Mises Institute conference, and maybe Jeffrey Tucker was there, but none of them could understand why either. But he was, you know, a great free market advocate, and he was finance spokesman for the Workers' Party. He was also the fiercest critic that Rupert Murdoch has ever had, even though he wasn't left-wing, obviously. When Murdoch finally stopped supporting Whitlam, Maxwell Newton said it must be because Whitlam had changed the Australian honours system, and so Murdoch could no longer be made a knight, and many other really strong insults. But that didn't stop Murdoch and Newton from reconciling in the 1980s, with Newton conceding that he was difficult and Murdoch conceding he was wrong to support so much government intervention in the economy. And Rupert Murdoch is still alive and influential, so even if only for that reason alone, Maxwell Newton should still be considered a highly relevant person for historical investigation. But only maxwellnewton.info has dug up any of his writings, and 2 years ago I was contacted by a major documentary company who made, I think it was that SBS series on Murdoch that was played about a year ago. It was a big thing, and they told me they want to interview Maxwell Newton to talk about what it's like to work with Murdoch. And because I call Maxwell Newton, Langhank, all these people staff members of mine because I employ their work. And so I had to tell her that, I'm sorry, Maxwell Newton died 21 years ago, but when I see him, I'll tell him. It's amazing how neglected these people are. I mean, you all know that famous Kerry Packer, 1991 House of Reps media ownership inquiry that Kerry Packer starred in, showing contempt for Costello and the other politicians. No one had tracked that down from the parliamentary archives until I did, put it online for a lot of attention. And when Rob Carlton was trying to get into character to play Kerry Packer for Paper Giants, I think ABC or Channel 9 TV series, he was trying to look for Kerry Packer footage. Couldn't find it anywhere, so he came to me. And so how did it happen that I'm the contact person for people who want to know about Kerry Packer? But on a side note, Rob Carlton's father is Jim Carlton, and Jim Carlton was one of the parliamentary dries, colleague of Bert Kelly. It was a kind of a weird kind of parliamentary dry because he supported arts funding, among other things. But and I guess there's another connection. When John Singleton kind of hijacked the federal election campaign for the Liberal Party in '74, Jim Carlton was the New South Wales director of the Liberal Party and supported John Singleton. I mean, I could talk about a lot. Well, there's a great friend of Nev's, Hans Thulstrup, deserves mention. He couldn't make it, but he'd be here. He's the inventor of the world's first solar car, founder of the World Solar Car Challenge, and he's, like most senior living environmentalist in Australia. And he's been very neglected too, but he's unusual in that he's a libertarian. He lives by example by being a libertarian. A lot of people talk about theory and this and that, but he's trying to live his life without ever accepting any government money. So he refuses to get a Medicare card. He's got some farmland in North Queensland, and it was affected by the floods. So he was eligible for the flood levy, the flood subsidy. He said no, doesn't want it, and because he said no, that meant he had to pay the tax to subsidise others. But so you can say it's silly, but at some point someone's got to stand up, and it's amazing. It's amazing. They deserve to be recognised. And Daniel Preston's father is another one who stands up. He's counted. Daniel Preston's here somewhere. But anyway, so Thulstrup's so neglected. He started writing some stuff for me, put it up, and someone contacts me saying, the wife of someone contacts me saying, can I speak to Hans Thulstrup? I think my husband is his son. So, and it turned out I was. Anyway, but just looking around the room, I mean, Nadia Bloom here, she ran great magazine called The Optimist in the 80s that featured exclusive interviews with Ron Paul, among others. Yeah. I mean, does anyone have any specific questions on any particular individual? Yeah, I mean, I read Liberty and Liberalism, that fat book. It's very long, very dense, and I don't know, but I remember one turn of phrase from, he wrote a book called, like, 3 Essays on Australian Political Economy, and I think I put up the introduction of that book. Yeah, I don't know. I haven't done as much research from people before Bert Kelly and before 1969. But, I mean, I have read all the Bruce Smith I can find, and I've just decided not to put it up in HTML form. So take from that what you wish.
Can you mention a bit more about Viv Forbes, who you alluded to just briefly?
Yeah, sorry, that's a good idea. Viv Forbes was going to be here, but unfortunately his wife, Judy, is unwell. He has to be with her. But Viv Forbes has been our most prolific and eloquent free market advocate for like each of the last 35 years. He was at the first Mises seminar in 2011 and gave a great speech. And whenever I'm researching anyone in the library, in the newspapers, you know, sometimes I just have a quick look at the letters to the editor page, and almost always there's Viv Forbes. He's more productive than any of us, and he came out of the Workers' Party. He was at the launch on Australia Day '75, and John Singleton kind of obliged him to become the Queensland spokesman, and yeah, he's the great hero of the movement. Yeah, I mean, I'm digging up more stuff all the time. I think there's about 100 items by him from over the last 30 years on vivforbes.info, and he's currently very active and passionate and as influential as anyone through the Carbon Sense Coalition, and the URL for that is carbon-sense.com. I'll tell you about one Viv Forbes essay, which is kind of on libertarian strategy. At the 1978 MPS meeting in Hong Kong, he gave a speech called The Myth of Constant Resources. And he said, everyone's saying, oh, we should just focus on theory, we should just focus on practice, we should just focus on history, we should just focus on water policy. And he was saying, no, everyone should focus on whatever they're interested in. And then the total pool of people interested, people with funds, will increase. There's not a fixed pool. So that was quite a good lesson on strategy for many of us. And talking about lessons on strategy, Bob Howard's 79 essay in Playboy on the Workers' Party, that had many great lessons on strategy. One of his great lines was that you know, people talk about being influential, and how do you measure that? And like, you know, if you suggest something that people will do anyway, does that mean you're influential? Which is kind of reducing it to the extremes. It's a great article. The other great insight, I think, if I can say so in front of Bob, is that he says the main, or one of the errors of the Workers' Party is that John Singleton and all the passionate activists, they were kind of trying to get votes, had a party system in place when they'd be better off just being pure shit stirrers. Yeah, there's something to be said for that. I mean, and you know, it was kind of like the height of John Singleton's career when he had the most to lose, when he was the most outspoken in defence of liberty. You know, whereas now, I mean, I don't think I think is in a great position and wouldn't have much to lose. So, yeah.
Our time's running out, so would you please join me in thanking Ben? And